Lightning. They dressed up for the wedding, sort of. Terry Kedsell wore his brown corduroy sport jacket, though the weather was snowy and he would have been better off in his winter coat. And she, in the lacy, delicate off-white dress she'd worn to other people's nuptials so many times that threads frayed along the seams and hem, and a thin, unmatching blue overcoat. Two people in their 40s, never before married, who had always watched other people take that step, ate and drank at their weddings and wondered what it was like, how it might feel immediately after taking the vows. She was keeping the name that she had signed on the license, Dominica Morley. She was Norwegian, Scotch, Irish, English, Welsh on her father's side, and Italian on her mother's, and her mother had won the name game when she was born. But everyone, even her mother, had always called her Sunday. Now, as they drove home from the courthouse, he realized that Sunday was really his, or sort of. In that dress, in her pale white hose, in her woven fabric shoes, and he hoped she was as aroused as he was, because he was thinking about taking those things off her piece by piece. The signs were good. She was laughing about the clumsy ceremony, how the judge had spun on his heel and walked away when it was over, and didn't even shake their hands, how Johnny Fish and his cousin Dory, who stood up for them, had dressed up better than they had themselves, so that the waitress in the bar where they went to lunch thought that their two Seneca Indian friends were actually bride and groom. But he knew he was marrying into trouble, because he'd known her long enough to see that the way she lived was like driving a car on ice with no seat belts. Not because she wanted it that way, he was sure that she didn't, but the best cards that she ever drew were like 4 of diamonds, 5 of clubs, go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200, etc. Actually, she'd only been in jail once, for a weekend, and the little cafe she'd inherited from her mother was hanging by a thread no matter how hard she worked. On the porch steps to the house, he picked her up to carry her in. She said, "Knock it off, Kedsell. Your back is about as good as—" But he didn't put her down. Sunday said, "The fucking door, Kedsell. How are you going to unlock it without dropping me on the porch?" "Reach in my left pocket. Keys are in there." Inside, he staggered with her in his arms and finally made it to the couch where she landed hard on the cushions. Then he straightened up and unbuttoned his sport coat. For a moment, he couldn't read her face. Was she suddenly afraid of him standing over her? Then she looked at his shoes. "Dory said if you got oversized feet, it means you're going to grow bigger. Another way that a man is like a puppy." Then she cracked up. Kedsell asked her if she wanted more champagne. They drank 1 bottle in the car in the parking lot of the courthouse with Dory and Johnny passing it back and forth, bubbling over on their shoes. "I've got to go to work," she said. Then she looked at her watch. "Okay, I've got a little bit yet." She went into the bedroom and came out minutes later in black jeans, a sweater, and sneakers, her usual work attire. He popped the cork, and it bounced off the kitchen ceiling and landed in the open butter dish with a soft splat. They both stared at the cork for a few seconds, as if they expected it to say something. He poured the champagne into 2 crystal flutes that Dory had given them. They sat and drank it and looked at each other over the table. One thing he knew for sure. He hadn't married the same woman he knew years ago, and yet he had. And she was and wasn't, because sometimes it seemed that another woman had slipped into her skin somewhere along the way with all new revelations of behavior. But the old Sunday kept showing up, the way old wallpaper flowers sometimes assert their faces through the paint that was meant to cover them, like the T-shirt he found once in the bottom of her drawer when she sent him there to find her KY jelly, with the printed slogan, "Keep your dirty hands off," and a picture of a woman kicking a man in the crotch. It seemed to bite him. He'd married a woman behind another woman, and on back, though he'd only exchanged rings with the woman in the front of that line. 20 years before, it was Donovan Hickey that Sunday was in love with, not Kedsell. She never moved in with Donovan, though he tried like hell, bought furniture that she liked, painted his living room walls a luminous orange at her mere suggestion that it might look interesting. But Sunday was only 22 and probably didn't want to think about long-range consequences. The sorting out process that brought him and Sunday together finally in their early middle age was blurry, almost untraceable. Each of them had been in love with this one and that one and made some forever promises. Furniture was bought and dumped, walls repainted, rings thrown out of car windows at high speed. All their relationships had a way of breaking up right before Christmas, as if they wanted to avoid having to buy an expensive present. One fiery August afternoon, Sunday and Donovan and Jumpy and Kedsell had decided to get some friends together to skinny dip at Hilford State Park, near the Big Tree Reservation. This was when Sunday was still bawling Donovan, long ago. Dory went along that day, and Johnny Fish, among others. Everyone was drinking beer, and somebody brought sloe gin, and somebody else brought a couple giant steaks to barbecue afterward, although no one remembered to bring a grill or even charcoal. Bear Pond was the most secluded water in the park, more or less off limits. You had to drive down an access trail that was just wide enough for the wheelbase of Kedsell's car. Donovan drove behind him in his Jeep. Mosquitoes were horrendous, but once they were in the water and thoroughly wet, they weren't so bad. Besides, in an hour, they were drunk. That was the first time Kedsell saw Sunday without clothes. She had a lightning-like scar down her back, red from the top of her right shoulder to the left cheek of her butt. Everybody was hushed about it for some reason. When he asked Dory what caused it, she said, "That we don't talk about." So it was another couple years before Donovan himself gave Kedsell a version when they were drinking in the Leghorn Lounge south of Hilford. Donovan was drinking bourbon that night and snarling like a peevish mutt. He was pissed off about losing Sunday to some other character, which had happened about a week before. Anyway, Kedsell asked him about the scar. "You telling me you don't know that?" Donovan said. "Would I be asking you if I did?" Donovan sucked back his cigarette and studied the ceiling for a minute or two. He blew a stream of smoke straight in the air. "All right, are you ready for this? One rainy afternoon when Sunday was 17, she was bawling this guy named Alfieri in her bedroom in her parents' house. It was a hot day, even though it was raining and they had the window open. I don't know where the hell her parents were at the time, but I think it was after her father ran off. Anyway, are you ready for this? She was on top riding Alfieri like a porpoise when this bolt of lightning came through the window and put the white sword right through her back, left that big jagged scar, and it fried Alfieri right between her legs." Kedsell sputtered, "Come on." Donovan's nostrils flared. "You think I'm making this up?" She said smoke even came out of Alfieri's nose. Kedsell said no. He didn't mean to say that Donovan, who was sometimes called Mellow, for the Donovan song Mellow Yellow, which was ridiculous because he was almost never mellow, was fabricating. But he really wasn't sure. How could she have survived such a thing? And if she did, how could she ever be normal again? And wasn't she more or less normal, at least on a subjective scale? Who wouldn't end up in the nut house over something like that, and probably never come out again? How come I never heard this before? Donovan rocked forward and crushed his cigarette out in the ashtray like he was mashing a bug. "That was when you was in the army, Peckerhead. Besides, both families hushed up the exact circumstances. How would you like to be Alfieri's mother and have to overhear someone making a joke about how her son died, huh?" By that point, Donovan was beginning to take on the snake face he wore when he was getting pissy drunk. Kedsell knew that meant, "Challenge me and I'll bust your skull like a china bowl." He wondered why Donovan was drowning his nerves in the Leghorn instead of hunting down Sunday's new lover, which would have been more in his character. Maybe he was afraid of what he'd do if he found him. "I'll tell you something else. She ain't the same girl that climbed into bed with Alfieri. The shock turned her into a mystic for 2 years. She's still kind of offbeat." "I don't know," Kedsell said. "Arnold Palmer's been struck by lightning 3 times on the golf course, and he isn't a mystic." Donovan shrugged. He never did get a better explanation, or any other. One night, much later, after he and Sunday were finally lovers and he'd moved into her house, she was walking around in her blue bareback nightgown, and he was sitting at the kitchen table, and when she opened the fridge for a Pepsi, he asked her how she got the scar. She turned and let the fridge door swing slowly shut without getting the soda, and she gave him her rarest face, unreadable as ancient scripture. "You telling me you don't know?" Which was almost exactly what Donovan had said. He sat up straight. "No, I mean, yes, I'm telling you I don't know." "What do you think?" she said. Then she opened the fridge again, but this time she took out one of her Seagram's coolers, picked up her cigarettes from the table, and walked out on the back porch to sit in a chair and drink it and smoke. He could see the back of her head through the screen door, and moths circling the light above her, and a frantic June bug banging the screen. He didn't go out to her. Sometimes, when they lay in bed deep in the night, he found himself reaching for her scar with his fingers, wondering what was true. Wondering, when she talked in her sleep, what language he was hearing, those incomprehensible words that garbled out of her mouth as if she were carrying on a high-juiced conversation with somebody back in long-ago Egypt. Was that more mystical stuff? But that day at Hilford Park, they swam and frolicked for a long time. Then they heard another vehicle coming up the utility access road. Everyone seemed to know at once that it was trouble and splashed out into the trees and hid, except Quetzal, just putting one leg into his underpants when a pickup truck pulled up with two men in the cab and the state park logo on the door. "What are you doing here, kid?" they wanted to know. He didn't like being called kid after 4 years in the Army, 2 of them overseas in Guam. "I'm putting my clothes on." "I can see that," the man at the steering wheel said, a trace of humor creeping into his voice. "Where's all the rest of them?" "Huh? The rest of who?" He was teetering. The man pointed to a pile of strewn clothes. "All those people." "They went home," Quetzal said. That cracked up the 2 parkmen, and Quetzal wanted to strangle them both. Then the man got serious again. "I want you all out of here as fast as you can get your skinny asses into your clothes. This part of the park isn't open to the public. Hear me?" At that, the man put the pickup truck into reverse and backed down the utility road. Quetzal's friends came out of the woods then, and they called him an idiot. Well, like, why the fuck didn't you run into the trees with us? Only Johnny Fish stuck up for him. Like, what the hell was he supposed to do? He was already getting dressed, and all her clothes were strewn around right in plain sight. Quetzal looked at the crowd of naked people, drunk and hostile, except for Johnny. Donovan's penis was in a kind of half hard-on, as if it aroused him to see that someone. Sunday turned and walked back to the pond and dove in, and the others followed her except for Johnny. Her scar was redder now, almost cranberry, and he wondered if anger or intoxication or physical activity or plain horniness put fire in that zigzag, the way such things could put red in someone's face. Quetzal stood at the edge of the pond and said, "Look, pals, if you don't climb out of there, the next visit is going to be from a sheriff, and somebody's got a pocket full of smoke in that pile of clothes." "They can't do nothing about it," Dory said, and Donovan said, "They can't go through our clothes without a warrant, you paranoid asshole." By now Quetzal was dressed. The scene had become like one of his dreams where a whole town was mad at him, or like the nightmare he'd had after reading the Shirley Jackson story about the stoning of a woman who drew the short straw. He felt in his pocket for his car keys. He told Johnny Fish he was leaving. "You want to go with me?" Johnny Fish, who for some reason was never called simply by his first name, said he'd better stick with Dory. "She gets in trouble too quick." "You want me to move Mello's Jeep?" "Nah," Quetzal said. "I think I'll go straight. It'll come out somewhere." The path wound for what seemed like miles, skirting between the border of the park and the reservation, bullet-riddled posted signs nailed to trees along the way, marking private property. He drove past the stony foundations of old farmhouses, abandoned long ago and swallowed up by the woods. Someone had told him once that families that lived up here had died in a smallpox epidemic, that the town people had come and torched the houses rather than risk handling the bodies. The sick were suddenly strangers. The thought of it gave him the creeps, even if it did happen several lifetimes ago. Finally, the path came to an end at a gravel road, probably Wartendijk Road, but a wooden gate, painted yellow and padlocked, blocked the exit, with a deep ditch on both sides. He drove his bumper tight up against the gate. Goosing the gas pedal, he pressed it and made it groan, but it was reinforced with a frame of solid wood posts. If he rammed the gate, he'd smash his grill and bust out his headlights. Maybe he was never going to get out of here. God damn it. Far off, a tractor growled. An animal that looked like a coyote bounded through the brush and disappeared. He got out and popped his trunk lid, grabbed his tire iron. Jamming the pry end under the bolts of the lock's swivel eye hasp, he yanked and leaned his weight on it until he snapped the lock away from the wood post. He pushed the gate, and it swung open, whining on its hinges like a kicked dog. Behind the wheel again, he lit a cigarette first, then turned out onto the gravel road. He drove with his windows down. The weather was dry, and he left an enormous wake of dust. At home, he could lay out in the backyard with a pitcher of gin and tonic and smoke a joint, let the sun burn him all it wanted. He was in town and almost home when he saw Sunday's purse on the seat next to his passenger door, a little bronze-colored zip bag. What the hell? How did that end up there? She hadn't even ridden in his car. Then he remembered he'd seen her sitting in his car smoking hash with Dory. He turned around at a gas station and started back. Then he slowed and pulled over. Damn it, it was her purse. Let her come and get it. But no. He wasn't so freewheeling that he could let something like this slide. His nature was always unsettled. His default setting was anxious, a bare electric wire in his hands. He knew cops would come and she wouldn't have any ID except the lightning scar and some freckles. Back on Wartendijk Road, he raised another long cloud of dust. He slowed for the broken gate, and just as he was about to turn, he saw the tail lights of 2 sheriff cars driving into the woods on the access path. He watched them until they disappeared. He sat in the gravel road with his directional on, reached over and opened the purse. Inside was a sour-smelling, half-a-liverwurst sandwich, her hash pipe, about $5 in change and dollar bills, eyeliner, a ring of keys, a tiny partial ball of hash in a wad of tinfoil, her birth control pills, pieces of a broken mirror in the shard of which he saw his own bloodshot eye, and a letter from the electric company, a notice of discontinuation of service for non-payment, and a stamp across it, paid, with the date of the day before and a receipt stapled to it that read 4:50 p.m. She'd coughed up the cash on the last possible day at 10 minutes to closing. He stuffed everything back in the purse and zipped it. Now a squid ink of nausea trickled through his stomach, and he didn't know if it was the result of the rotten sandwich smell or all the beer, or just the fact that he had invaded Sunday's intimate space in such a creepy way. On the other hand, by dragging his feet on the way back, he'd probably saved her from getting busted for the pipe and the chip of hash. Later, he heard that the 2 sheriff cars stopped at the pond. The deputies stood and watched them put their clothes on and then wrote each of them a misdemeanor trespassing ticket. They all got $100 fines. He felt sorry for Johnny Fish, who had stuck around only for Dory. She actually came close to getting locked up, hollering at the deputies, "You can't give a ticket to an Indian for trespassing. It's our fucking land." So that was all Quetzal knew about his wife's scar. He'd read a news story once about 3 women at a church picnic who got blasted when lightning hit the tree they were sitting under. Why did they die while Sunday survived a direct strike, if in fact she did get struck? It was part of the storehouse of information that Sunday kept from him, but for some reason he was the only one she never told. "Forget it, Quetzal," she'd said the next and last time he brought it up. That was another thing. She always called him by his last name. And now, sipping the wedding champagne, he looked at her and wondered, if he didn't know the answers to such heavy personal issues, were they really even married? Legally, of course. But psychically, even spiritually? She said, "Well, you've got the rest of the day off, don't you? Why don't you drive me to work and pick me up after I close, like a good husband?" She picked the cork from the butter dish and tried to pound it into the bottle with the heel of her hand, but it refused to go in. "Then we can finish this if you want." He got another old cork out of the kitchen drawer and punched it into the bottleneck. "Will you get back into your wedding dress, then?" She looked confused for a moment. Then she laughed. She stood and picked up her purse. "I'll do anything you want, Quetzal." But he knew that was provisional. He was always holding that bare wire, like most Americans probably. Sunday, on the other hand, was never scared. Pissed off a lot of the time, but afraid? No. Was that what happened to somebody who survived a lightning strike? As they walked to his car, he thought maybe he'd keep his old tape recorder under his bed, and the next time he heard her talking in that weird language, he'd hit the record button and try to decipher it later by playing it backward. Opening the car door, she said, "What are you laughing at, Quetzal?" "Everything, I guess," he said.